If you don't know, what I'm going to be talking about today is punk rock in the Midwest. So maybe not something you normally think about with history. So some people may be kind of wondering, like, what exactly is punk rock? And I thought it'd be great to kind of start off with a few different examples of that. One of the first songs here that I'm going to play for you is Blitzkrieg Bop, a famous song by the Ramones that I'm sure most of you will recognize. So, little taste there, little idea. So that's some of the earliest punk rock of where, it started. And from the Ramones, they're originally from New York. And when we see punk rock first starting in the mid-1970s, it's in these major urban areas, these urban centers like New York City, eventually into London with bands like The Clash and the Sex Pistols. But then from there, it even expands to places like Los Angeles. But by the time we get into the 1980s, we see punk rock expanding outside of those areas and even into the Midwest, where we get bands like the Zero Boys from Indianapolis. And here's a little taste of that called Living in the 80s. So, little taste there, a little bit faster, talking about the Beatles and these things, and people to kind of wake up to this new decade and new music for youth that are hearing this. And so, while we had bands like that, what we also get is in the 1980s is what's called hardcore, where it's even a faster, more aggressive type. And this band here, the Crucifix, who are from Lansing, Michigan, here's a little taste of what they had to play. So, as we see in the 1980s, from what we originally had with the Ramones is that punk rock became much more aggressive. But also, what's been difficult for scholars to understand with punk rock is how all three of those songs I just played, like how to identify this, like what makes them, what links them together, and things like that. And I think one of the best ways to understand punk rock and it as a style of music is to view it as urban folk music. And so considering it as folk music, it's also protest music, but also a reflection of the culture and the time, particularly by youth. And so for punk rock, as a reflection of this changing United States, if we think about it as urban folk music, earlier in the 20th century, most people, the United States was in mostly of a rural area. But by later in the century, what we see is this growing development of urban and even suburban. And so what we see by historian Dwyer McLeod is where he talks about how by in the 1980s, where we saw this hardcore, this fast, aggressive type of music, as it developing as a reaction to this changing. And for McLeod, where he focused on was in Southern California, primarily the Los Angeles area. And what McLeod said was that this hardcore reflected the suburban growth, or even this shift to a post-suburban thing. And so one of the other points that is important from McLeod's thing that he acknowledges is that in the 1980s that there was Ronald Reagan. And that Reagan became one of the key targets of punk rock. And it was not just because of his conservative values or anything, but because it was a target for somebody to put their frustration. But if we look at Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, we kind of view Reagan, or should view Reagan, less as a political figure and more as a cultural one. Because as historians have been looking further into the 1980s, they've been examining how that Reagan's ability was to become everything that was America. And he was a cowboy to people in the West, and the Midwest, here, he presented himself as a farmer, as he was originally from Illinois. But as many bands would angrily denounce Ronald Reagan and attack him as an icon, it was a little bit different in the Midwest. As a 1983 interview with the Milwaukee band Die Kreuzen explained, instead of just doing "fuck Reagan, I hate the government," bands should explain themselves in the lyrics. And as the band further explained their point here, what they said is that it's not just the fact that Reagan is president, it's the fact that this country could elect somebody like Reagan. And so what Die Kreuzen was really pointing at was that the issue was not just Reagan himself, but that the culture that had shifted. And what we see that happening is in the 1980s. But in this interview, what Die Kreuzen also explained was that the great thing about punk rock was that what kids could do, instead of idolizing bands like Foreigner, is that they could create their own bands. And they could do their own kind of music. And instead of sitting around listening to R.O. Speedwagon sing about some pretty girl for the millionth time, they could listen or play music that actually explained what they were experiencing and what was happening with them. And what became important to the Midwest with bands like Die Kreuzen is that they helped to establish a punk community throughout the whole Midwest. And there was all these different, spread out from Ohio all the way to Nebraska, and then from Missouri all the way up to Minneapolis. And different areas, even down in Kansas City, gave credit to Die Kreuzen for helping them set up a community and establish this thing. And in addition with them, there'd be other bands like the Effigies from Chicago or the Zero Boys, who I played earlier, from Indianapolis. And so this interview, though, too, what Maximum Rock and Roll asked Die Kreuzen was why they called their latest album Cows and Beer. And the band simply replied, well, that's the kind of stereotype for what it's like around Wisconsin. And as we look at this album cover here, we do see that, where there is this rural imagery, this Christian value over there on the right. But what's not so stereotypical is the background, where there's this urban center where punk rock could be heard from. And this is one of the problems with the Midwest, has been holding on to this rural identity, even though as we've come farther in the 20th century, it's become an increasingly urban center. And this is one of the things that James Shortridge, a geographer, wrote in 1989, talking about as the Midwest has shifted and become more of an urban with more industrial types of things, the Midwest has held on to this rural imagery and this pastoralism type of values. But all of this really changed and economically, just like as Dewar McLeod was talking about how in Southern California that suburbia was turning into post-suburbia, there was this economic restructuring. And we had the same thing happening in the Midwest. However, what happened in the Midwest was the farm crisis, which began roughly around 1980 and lasted until about 1986. And the issue with the farm crisis is while it tremendously impacted small farmers, it also impacted the industry and the manufacturing within the region. So places like here in Waterloo, as we see over in John Deere, with less farmers going out of business and such, is that they were also cutting off jobs. And we're seeing this transition into a different type of economy that's not so much based on the agriculture. But so the Midwest, if we think about it, as a region, it may seem kind of strange in recent times to think, why would this rebellious music be playing here? But that's not necessarily, the Midwest has held on to these. It used to be a place of populism and kind of these leftist reforms, as Thomas Frank said in What's the Matter with Kansas, where farmers stuck up against big business, and people like on the left, John Brown was a famous abolitionist pushing forward. So as Thomas Frank wrote this over a decade ago, kind of asking this question about his home state of Kansas. And I think that his point there of what's the matter with Kansas, one of the most important things a reader can take from it is this idea of a quasi-civil war between the rural and the urban America, and this divide to really think. Whereas we saw in the farm crisis, the two are related, where one disaster hit farmers and it ended up impacting the urban areas as well. And more historians have kind of looked at this comparison of the first Gilded Age, where we talk about the early 20th century, late 19th century, where there's massive wealth inequality and big business is pushing down on labor and everything. But as historians have looked at that, they've started seeing from the mid-1970s, around when punk rock started, to today, what they've called the second Gilded Age. And one of these historians who's talked about this is Steve Frazier, where he's called it the Age of Acquiescence, where he says the difference between the two is that during the first Gilded Age, there was resistance and this struggle and this fight against big business and big money. But that became something forgotten. But one of those things that Frazier missed in his point talking about that is that there still existed resistance, and we can see that in punk rock. Now, so this punk community, starting in the Midwest. What makes it really important as a region is where places like New York and Southern California, Los Angeles, those are huge urban centers where there's punk rock all over. But in the Midwest, it's more sparse. They're separated. And it became more of this do-it-yourself idea out of necessity versus out of style. And so what we see in the Midwest is punk rockers creating their own fanzines, like Free Beer Press here, which is from Kalamazoo, Michigan. And in these fanzines, as these pictures show, of course they attacked Ronald Reagan, but it was also in these fanzines where they would give reviews of records, talk about their local community. They would publish letters that people would write to them. And the fanzines also carried this idea where if you don't like what we're writing, go ahead and make your own fanzine, kind of this empowering thing. And so with these fanzines too, what helped in the Midwest was to spread their music, as these are advertisements up here which were from Maximum Rock and Roll that became internationally distributed. So people from anywhere around the country, even the world, could look through these and see something like America's Dairyland, a compilation album of all Wisconsin bands. Or over on the right, what we have is an ad for Affirmation Records, which started with their master tape, which was larger outside of it. It was the Midwest, a compilation tape that helped to really get bands out there and so that they get known. But within these ads too, or within these fanzines, these punk rockers would also write about their local areas. Where this punk rocker from Green Bay called his area, his scene, New, which stood for Northeast Wisconsin. And he also put this crude map here, which I think says a lot about the Midwest, where you see these centers where there's punk rock scenes, but then this huge void wasteland where they write of farms and Lynyrd Skynyrd fans. And I think that's an important thing, because if we look at the Midwest, it's an area where driving is something that, it's important, and you drive through farm fields all the time. It's something that author Bill Bryson, who's from Iowa, wrote in The Lost Continent. To reach anywhere of ever-passing interest from Des Moines by car requires a journey that in other countries would be considered epic, which I think kind of sums up a lot. And that's something, though, that became very reflected from Midwest punks talking about traveling and having to go through all these towns and everything, and just continuously. It's one thing to drive from suburb to suburb in Los Angeles, but in the Midwest, if you wanted to play elsewhere, you had to drive all the way from Milwaukee to St. Paul, Minneapolis area, perhaps. And so this wasteland idea became something that's very important. But what we also see is that they reflected, though, throughout these wasteland travels, they saw the impact of the farm crisis. That's my dad there, so it's all right if he's interrupting me there. So what we see is, though, of these Midwesterners talking about the farm crisis. And during the early 1980s, there was a major recession that hit the United States. And in particular, the greatest impact was in the Midwest, where there's this economic restructuring going on. And this here is a band from Dayton, Ohio, called Toxic Reasons. And this is a cover for a single, Ghost Town, which is kind of one of the things where you see during the farm crisis, we see kind of these small towns and the old idea of what an American town was started disappearing as big business started coming in. Now, Toxic Reasons, they also became interviewed by Maximum Rock and Roll. And when they were asked, how's the scene in the Midwest these days, the band replied, well, bands are popping up all over the place, but it's the Bible Belt. Jerry Falwell is president there. There's complete control over the media. Clubs open and get shut down in a flash. The people are there, but the bars aren't. And this statement there by Toxic Reasons is important, because what we see in the Midwest is that bars became a place that many punk bands tried to avoid, and what became important was all ages shows. With a small scene to begin with, having a show that any punk could go to was very important to help strengthen their community. And so what the Toxic Reasons also pointed to was how these independent labels and everything were very important to their local scene. Again, kind of comparing to talking to Maximum Rock and Roll, which was from the Bay Area and San Francisco. The band pointed to the editors who were interviewing them that just said, hey, you guys are lucky. Where we're from, the talking heads are too hard to be played on radio stations. So this talk kind of goes on for a while, and Maximum Rock and Roll finally asked, well, have people in the Midwest caught on to anything yet? And how they replied, well, people just aren't that pissed yet. I was watching election returns in the Midwest where there's the highest unemployment, and they still voted conservative. And we get back to that idea where it's not just the issue, but it's that Reagan's president, but that people elected him. And what you see is they kind of talk about this cultural idea. The band replied or added to their comments saying, well, that's because they send Mr. Puppet Man, Mr. Reagan out on these tours. They hold them in a big silo or something and hand people American flags at the door, telling them they're going to be on TV, media hype. And so as they're explaining this situation, they describe their scene back in Ohio as comparing it to the grapes of wrath, saying that there's these unemployed roaming the countryside looking for work, driving in vans, and suggesting that with 4 kids to feed and without no work to do, these people go crazy. And so as this image shows, though, Toxic Reason was one of the more overt political, they were more directly political. This is an anti-war song, something that became very common in the 1980s punk rock. But so within the 1980s punk rock scene, though, we see this band out of the Twin Cities called Husker Du, which I think kind of encompasses not only just Midwest punk rock, but also kind of 1980s punk rock as a whole. Now, Husker Du, their lead singer and guitarist, Bob Mould, who's on the far right there, he was not originally a Midwesterner, as he was from rural upstate New York. But he came to the Twin Cities in the late 1970s to attend Malacaster College in St. Paul, which was a prestigious school that was very active during the counterculture of the 1960s, and was also had renowned kind of liberal icons like Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale. But when he got to Malacaster College in the late 1970s, he saw that things were changing and this culture was changing. This school that used to be a kind of a liberal hotbed started having these young Republicans, and Mould just couldn't handle that. And he got tired of debating in class all the time and everything. And it was in the punk rock scene where Mould ended up finding these 2 other characters, Grant Hart and Greg Norton, who are both locals from the area. And they started playing this band, Husker Du, and the 3 of them clicked and created music that was just unbelievable to people within the Midwest scene, but also outside. One author, Michael Azerrad, has described their music saying that although they got casted as a hardcore band, what they were really doing was playing folk rock music at light speed, encased in an almost palpable cloak of warming electronic distortion, car accident drumming, and extreme volume. So it was, as I said, folk music, but just at a very, very fast speed. And the idea with Husker Du was, although that they were political, it was a political way and more of a personal level, and not just so much as we get back to Die Kreutzen saying, fuck Reagan, I hate the government, but more of this explaining yourself type of way of going about it. And Husker Du, they ended up, as I was saying, they kind of tell, the idea of a 1980s punk band. When they first started playing, they were hoping that they were going to get a record contract, and it never came. And what they ended up doing was taking out a loan from one of their mom's banks, a small $2,000 loan, to start their own record company. And with this, then, they gained that independence to start producing their own music and their own albums, such as Zen Arcade, their 1984 album, which became a huge hit throughout the punk, and also, though, the popular presses started recognizing them. And as they started progressing throughout their career, what we see is that the major labels started bringing an interest to them. And although taking a lot of heat, in 1985, they finally signed with Warner Brothers. But what made this unique was that they signed with Warner Brothers while retaining their independence. Unlike many of the other bands who were signed into major labels, Husker Du made sure that they had every right to their album, from the cover of it to the music, the tracks, and everything in it. They gained that meanwhile. And their idea with signing with Warner Brothers was to reach a larger audience. However, that didn't necessarily happen. And so after releasing a few albums with Warner Brothers and not having any increased album sales, the band ended up breaking up in 1987 after fights within, things like that. But what's important with Husker Du, although they didn't even last a decade, was that what they did to music in general was influence. And to punk rock, they would influence punk-like bands to follow, such as Nirvana and the Pixies. And so as we get kind of to the close of the 1980s, by the time that Husker Du is leaving, we see that as they were an older crowd, there was these younger groups of punks who they just didn't quite click with. And we see punk rock kind of starting to lose its edge, where there's this Cornerstone, which was a music festival that would have tens of thousands of people outside of Chicago in a suburb. And within that, they would have heavy metal and even punk rock, such as this the band called The Lead, who is from Florida, playing there. And it would be at these shows where newspaper reports said that you would see suburban housewives and ministers next to kids sporting mohawks, which kind of takes away the thrill and the shocking aspect of it as punk rock became part of more mainstream culture. But then, as we get into the 1990s, there becomes another stale moment in the music industry. When punk first started with bands like the Ramones, a lot of their rebellion was aimed at music itself. And it was because there was a few major labels that controlled the music industry. And as we get closer to the 1990s, the same thing happened, where there's changes in technology that made it more difficult to have your own independent label, and it became kind of more of a monopolized market. But when we see bands like Nirvana, their 1991 album, Nevermind, that totally changed things and opened up this avenue for a new wave of punk with a new generation. And what we see coming out of the Midwest is bands like Screeching Weasel, who are from Screeching Weasel, who's from Chicago, who would go on to influence bands such as Green Day, which would be one of the most notable groups. And in the 1990s, we see this huge boom throughout punk rock all over again, almost as if it happened, repeating itself from the 1980s. And we see it even in Des Moines. But by 1997, we see the scene starts to die out, and these three Des Moines punk rockers start a show, which is a satirical version of the Decline of Civilization, a famous documentary on LA punk rock from the early 1980s. What they called their show was the Recline of Midwestern Civilization. And the idea behind that was that, you know, all of a sudden everybody stopped going to punk rock shows and everybody kind of just reclined and gave up on it. But I think, though, that title of that show reflects a little bit more about the Midwest in general. It is also by this time in the 1990s where we see the further kind of monopolization of farming and stuff, and the continuation of this problems from the farm crisis. You know, as we look over in Waterloo or many other towns throughout Iowa, you still see the impact of them today. So, thank you. I'm going to open this up to questions then. Try to keep that short there, but great. Yes.
So what was the reaction amongst Christians for like bands like Petra and POD? Was that just like a Christian reaction in response to the music, or just Christians like, hey, I like this beat, I'm going to throw something religious about it? I don't know if you're really familiar with
I'm not familiar with them.
Okay.
Is that a Christian
well,
rock band?
Like, have you ever heard of Petra?
Yeah, but I was really little.
Yeah, I don't know, I grew up, my dad was a minister, he's like, hey, you can only listen to music as long as it was religious, so I listened to Chevelle and Petra and all these like rock sort of things, but as long as they were
Striper.
Yeah, as long as they were pegged as Christian, you were good to listen to it, and you'd listen to them and they'd sound just the same as anybody else. I was just throwing out, is that just more of like, kind of like a Christian reaction to adapt to?
A little bit, yeah, and that's I would say that that's something that you kind of see from the 1960s, kind of the counterculture, where you see also this kind of rock music as being seen as the devil's music, to kind of being like, well, if it gets more kids to be into Christianity and things like that, it became more.
Because in the '80s, you definitely see heavy metal and punk rock, very distinct kinds of music, and heavy metal is more of a Midwestern thing. And I wonder if you ran across any articles that dealt with that. For instance, heavy metal got the satanic label.
Right.
Punk rock is more like Quincy had an episode about punk rockers and it showed how bad they were. Even Alvin and the Chipmunks had a cartoon episode where the Chipmunks went punk and they learned their lesson. It was a bad thing. And so I'm wondering, did you run across anything because the image of punk rock, people would know about the image, they assumed it was all on the East Coast or the West Coast, or it came from England. It had this exoticism in the Midwest. Do you run across people talking about that? And so maybe that is part of the reason it didn't run across, as well as the predominance of classic rock from the 70s and heavy metal among suburban white kids.
Kind kind of lost me there. No, so, I mean, as far as, if we look at heavy metal and punk, and sorry if I don't directly answer this, but I'm kind of where my mind's wandering. That is something that there's a lot of relationship, at least between the culture of having fanzines and stuff like that. What's interesting is in the 80s, I think that you definitely see where, especially in hardcore, there's kind of this, where hardcore bands kind of became heavy metal, and the long hair idea, which originally was completely frowned upon in punk rock, and I think in the Midwest it was a little bit more open. From what I saw in a lot of fanzines, there was positive reviews of things like AC/DC and stuff. It wasn't just so much like, we hate that kind of music. But the exotic kind of aspect, I think, is something, too, which more of the punk fashion. And that's something that I definitely saw where, people saying, like a band, the Necros, who were from Maumee, Ohio, a small little town there. But they were saying in the punk, in the Midwest, having a mohawk is something that scares people. But you kind of see it, though, later on where it becomes more of this cultural type of fashion thing and less shocking kind of is idea, so.
Yes. John, I mean, you've been like, even though you talk a lot about this like solidarity between all of these groups, right? But I mean, it's music, it's competitive, right? There is some competitive nature to it.
Yeah.
Did you sense that there were any kind of turf wars between, West Coast bands like the Minutemen and bands from the East Coast and the Midwest? I mean, kind of like, I don't want to juxtapose it with like gangster rap, with the whole like West Coast, East Coast thing. But did you find that there was any of that type of animosity that really might have infringed on the purpose of the movement?
Well, in the Midwest, particular, kind of a little rival that kind of is actually from the Twin Cities, where there was Husker Du on one hand, but on the other hand, there was a band called the Replacements. And Husker Du was, the Replacements, they played like one show and got a record contract right away. And Husker Du, they had to end up putting out their own, making their own label and stuff. So there was that kind of rivalry. But looking at it as a larger thing, I think it was more based on ideas. There were certain bands who were, communists, anarchists or something, and that were a little bit more. And there's other bands who tried to be completely apolitical.
I'm asking you because there was a lot of friction, particularly between the Minutemen and Violent Femmes. And Violent Femmes were sometimes even considered to be punk rock in some cases, because they're out in Milwaukee, right? They were totally working class.
Yeah.
But there was that rift there. But maybe I'm just blowing it up.
Yeah, there's some. I think a lot of the divides, though, kind of, especially in the Midwest, kind of came. It's like, well, we need a show and need people. So you see some of those. That's where even the Replacements and Husker Du, even though they were kind of portrayed as a rival, they still played together and would help each other out in that way.
Wasn't there I was just a question, in the Midwestern scene, don't you think? It's like, I know this growing up when I finally got into punk, even like Minneapolis and Chicago, these were Shangri-La, these are impossible places to go, whereas beside Cedar Falls, which had a scene.
Right.
And still has a scene.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So do you see any kind of difference between that? Because Husker Du, major band, and legendary band, same with the Replacements, or in Chicago, the Effigies in Big Black.
Yeah.
But here, House of Large Size is very well known in Iowa, outside of Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if you noticed perhaps that.
Well, that's something, kind of talking about this, early on, it seemed where the punk rock, especially in the Midwest, these different scenes were working together. But as some of those bands kind of got out of the way, I think it became more of this local type of thing. And I'm sure there was kind of some local pride and kind of stuff involved in that mixed in. Yeah, Alex?
In your research, what do you think was the most frustrating aspect for these bands in seeing their culture and their society change towards, like you said, this raving culture? What was the most frustrating aspect to them?
I think the most thing is, this was such kind of a revolutionary change kind of thing, and I think it was just not necessarily being able to see that. I think some of what makes punk special was that it was a youth culture, and so there wasn't necessarily that cognitive dissonance kind of seeing that difference. But with Reagan stepping in office, he was, he kind of was the legacy of the New Right and Barry Goldwater. But as Sidney Blumenthal, a journalist, wrote, during Reagan's first inauguration, Goldwater was like, "This is too much for me," and it was that glorifying of wealth was kind of the big difference. And so, I think so. Yeah, just kind of that idea of, people not opening their eyes or just kind of celebrating this is kind of the fusion of the me generation and the yuppie culture kind of thing is what the rebellion was aimed at. So.
How do these bands deal with the inevitable paradox of them trying to remain a small circle and within a certain category, but because they're trying to go mainstream, aren't they inevitably destroying their image of being rebellious? Because ultimately, they're going to be accepted by an audience, extended to a greater audience. And we talked about this earlier, you and I, and all of a sudden, punk, where once it was viewed as rebellious, is kind of cool and acceptable, and you got other kids that maybe weren't even associated with it for political reasons or other reasons, were now just trying to express themselves through that way too. So that band kind of loses its identity. What did they do in that? Was there anything, were they conscious about this? What did they do to try to preserve that image of still being rebellious? But just like anything else, it kind of becomes mainstream. It loses its effect. And you can see that definitely throughout the hip hop community stuff. A rapper comes up from underground, he goes mainstream, all of a sudden he's not hard anymore, or he's not really that image of what they were. So that these bands experience that too, and what do they do to preserve that?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely experienced it. And the way I kind of view punk is in this kind of different generational shift where the early, 1970s bands like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols, very kind of revolutionary, but it became popular too. And then there's always kind of this pushback against that, but it's difficult because a lot of these bands wanted to reach a larger audience. And you see in the 90s, I guess the best example would kind of be like a band like Green Day, where although the punk community, kind of this idea of a battle over authenticity, but still the kind of causes that Green Day supports and stuff are, I would say, still kind of to their roots and everything, even if the punk community kind of rejects them.
Yes.
John, you took us up basically to the turn of the century. What's happened in the last 15 years?
Well, since then, this is, as Reagan viewing him as a cultural figure with punk too, I think that, the two are connected just because of their, continuity to today. And the past few years, though, it's kind of this thing where it seems like whenever people really get angry is when it starts up again. So during the Bush years, after the Iraq War, we see kind of the early to mid 2000s, this kind of pushback. But then it kind of went, fell apart again. This kind of anger went away. But as we see in recent, as somebody pointed out about the Cedar Falls still having community and stuff. There was just earlier in the before the caucus in Iowa, there was a Shred for Bernie concert that went on in Waterloo. It was actually the second one. They did one in Cedar Falls before. And so it's still there, and there's other bands. There's a band from Providence who's gotten noticed nationally by the Rolling Stone. Apologize, I can't think of their name right now. But then too, there's been reports about how, and by Vice News, about Chicago and this booming scene there again. So it's just kind of this one thing where it seems like, to me, I think that's where the urban folk music kind of comes in, where it's a simple way of playing, but it's a way for especially youth to kind of express themselves, and so.
Just a quick follow-up. Maybe for me as a sort of a mainstream kind of guy, I've been intrigued by South by Southwest and the festival there and what that's done. Has punk made inroads at that festival, or is it being shunted out?
I don't know about festivals. What's interesting, I think, about festival-wise, though, is that there was, in the early 90s, things like Lollapalooza or the Vans Tour and stuff, the Warped Tour, which were kind of these punk big tours and stuff. And we had like Woodstock 94, where there was punk bands that played there. But it's kind of, a lot of those large shows have been there's been a lot of big corporate influence where people are paying $16 for a large Budweiser or something like that. And so it's kind of...
There were 1,500 bands in Austin at South by Southwest last year. So
I'm sure that there is some that at least started kind of their roots there. A lot of bands like Nirvana, they started their roots kind of in the hardcore scene, and that's something that Dave Grohl, who's now with the Foo Fighters, still kind of credits back to, and it's been an influence.
Just to follow up with what John said, I remember when going to punk shows when I was young, and it was all about intimacy. It's like I never went to a big auditorium or amphitheater. It was always like kind of like a garage or a barn or something, and where the acoustics were horrible, but it didn't really matter, right? So I don't know if you found that in your work that was kind of the typical scene.
Yeah, there was basements. especially though those kind of eventually started getting cracked down a lot by police. And so you see like in the Midwest, a lot of them using like veterans halls, things like that. Or in like Iowa City, they for a time used the basement of a church to play shows because that was the only place that they could find. And so it was kind of whatever space they could use to kind of put on shows. But then, which, like you said, no, is very different though from these large concerts and things that we see today.
Yeah, we used to always like, after a show, we should always gauge like, who had the most bruises, from, and our girlfriends hated it because they'd have to like, look what happened to you, and it's like you were at a fight, like, oh, we were at a show or something.
Yeah.
So it was always that that type of culture, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's another thing. The big festivals kind of discourage that type of violent dancing and stuff. And I mean, while there was those in the 90s where you had big shows, I mean, there's police who would come shut it down and everything, even bring out fire hoses and stuff like that. So.
Can you speak a little bit about the Rock Against Reagan movement?
Yes. So that was one thing that started in 1984. There was this tour, Rock Against Reagan, that was put on by the Yippies, the Youth International Party, well known from the counterculture. And it was essentially to stop Ronald Reagan was the idea. It wasn't necessarily to support a candidate or anything, but to so it was there'd be these free concerts, and this is something I thought of because the band The Crucifix from Lansing, they were one of the first headline bands to play in this. And they toured all across the United States. They even played in Iowa City and Ames, here, small towns like Bloomington, Indiana, and such. But they eventually got all the way to the two biggest shows would be at the national conventions for both the Republican and the Democratic Party, and ended up being a lot of police kind of pushback and everything in there and violence. But
Are there any T-shirts from that?
I mean, they said that they sold T-shirts and they all went towards the cause is kind of which I'm assuming is to stop Ronald Reagan, but they weren't funded very well, so a lot of bands were pretty upset. I'm sure it kind of went to more help them play, but yeah, I don't know of any. I mean, I found flyers and stuff for it, but I'm sure somebody somewhere has
Or
a.
on eBay?
Yeah.
So, like, did you ever explore the idea of like punk just sort of being this sort of, I guess, almost protest against the way mainstream American culture was going, even though they knew they couldn't change it? Like, America was going towards this more like conservative, like free market enterprise sort of outlook,
Yeah.
which they detested. So did they ever, like, did band members, like, in interviews ever speak to that, like, knowing that, it's kind of a lost cause, but fuck it, we gotta fight the good fight?
Yeah. Well, you said kind of a lost cause idea. I mean, there was apathy, and that was one of the things that kind of made people really upset, where nobody's caring. But it happened in the punk scene as well. But I mean, there's definitely though. I mean, that's with the Rock Against Reagan thing, where it wasn't just so much Reagan, but more of the culture and this idea of the me generation and yuppie culture kind of thing. So,
Like, on a quick follow-up, like, you made me think about it when talking about Kansas, like, which used to be, like you said, this progressive, liberal bedrock, and then kind of turned into this very conservative state. Were there any bands that came out of Kansas specifically?
yeah, there is, and that's something actually in that book. Thomas Frank mentions a few. I haven't found too much about the Kansas City scene itself, and it's kind of tough looking at scenes. I mean, there's almost any college town in the U.S. It seems like there was a scene somewhere, but you get smaller places too. It was West Liberty in Iowa City. There was a well-known band there, and I saw somebody writing a report saying, you think you have it tough, try living in a town in the middle of Iowa, a small little town. So, yeah.
I really enjoyed the talk. I think you really got a good project here. But I wonder about the limits to the subversion, the subversiveness with the punks. These are white guys. Big Black was mentioned earlier. Steve Albini, Big Black, was at Northwestern when I was. Northwestern's not really a hotbed of subversion. And Albini, well, the title of that album, Big Black, that was kind of a nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Yeah.
He was kind of racist. How does that fit?
Well, and that's something, especially in the mid-1980s, is where like racism really became one of the big problems, and kind of just fighting and racism, sexism. And what we see is in the 1990s, a lot of scenes kind of, as they became more locally focused, kind of pushed against that, where there would be like ABC No Rio was one of the better known venues in New York, or else there would be 924 Gilman Street in Berkeley. And what these scenes did is that they really pushed to, you know, they'd have signs up that would say no homophobia, no racism, no sexism kind of thing. And so, you know, we do see, especially in the mid-1980s, kind of this homogenous kind of, you know, male-dominated culture. And a lot of that, I think, was with hardcore music. And it's especially because when you look at when punk first started, like, you know, women, there was a lot of women involved. And looking at in the Midwest scene, you know, I found a few in bands, but not as much as like what you would see in San Francisco or Los Angeles kind of thing. So, yeah, it's kind of one of the...
In the 80s, though, like within hardcore, like some people have suggested that it was actually the Bad Brains, African-American Rasta band from DC who invented hardcore.
Yeah.
At one point, the Guinness Book of World Records had them as the world's fastest band.
Mm-hmm.
And someone, you know, I don't know if that, I don't even know if that had much impact here in the Midwest. But it's like bands that took bloody noses to bring about that kind of egalitarianism that was more the hallmark of 90s. Punk. So
It'd be like Millions of Dead Cops in DC was one of those big bands for that. Same with
but
Reagan Youth.
I see, you see that coming out of it. I think, I don't know, do you suppose that is perhaps a transfer from England? Because in England you had Rock Against Racism, and everyone from like The Clash to Crass were a part of that.
Yeah.
They were like, English punks were more interested in ska and reggae. Which hadn't really come to the United States till Bad Brains.
Right. One of the things is there is he's a scholar, I'm not sure, I think in English or literature. His name's David Ensminger, who's done quite a bit. And that's one of the things he talked about where, you know, and his kind of point with that is as, you know, as you get like hip hop culture of kind of this divide of where rock music's white music, hip hop's black music kind of shift or idea, and so he kind of says that it's more of that, but then points to, you know, groups like Bad Brains and others like the Dead Kennedys drummer, his name's slipping my mind right now, but he was African American, and there's quite a few others early on, but yeah.
I'm going to take you back to the original question about Christian rock,
Mm-hmm.
because a couple things occurred to me. One, I think earlier when we've talked about this, you mentioned a video that was anti-punk, anti-rock, produced by someone in the Christian right. I may not be remembering that correctly. You referred to it in your thesis defense, I think.
Well, there's a few different,
Okay.
of saying that punk was anti...
Videos produced by Christians to promote a different kind of listening, as in anti-punk. I'm thinking of the acronym.
One thing would be the Parents Music Resource Center, the PMRC, which is a group of, they were called the Washington Wives, was kind of their nickname, but it was a group that presented themselves as concerned mothers, and they were kind of the ones that pushed for censorship of music. For the punk, where it became notable was with the Dead Kennedys. They became in a huge legal battle over that. They had an H.R. Giger poster inside one of their albums. And so, but yeah, that eventually led up to the parental explicit warning label that we're all familiar with.
Just a sidelight, if you Google it, you can find the Oprah Winfrey episode that has Ice-T and Jill Biafra together talking about the PMRC.
Right, Biafra, he was actually on the show twice, I believe once in '87 and then later in like '91, kind of thing. So, yeah.
To that point, something interesting that happened at the time was a lot of families on the East Coast and West Coast whose kids would get into punk and get into trouble would send their kids to the Midwest to live with grandma as a punishment. And, I knew a number of people in the state of Iowa who came from Modesto, California or Southern California, and what that did, it's almost like, a tree spreading its spores, and, those people then came to Iowa and started bands and started scenes and kind of created this whole...
That's fair. Yeah, I haven't crossed that. That's really interesting, though. I did notice, in like there was a group in LA who tried to make this. It was, send your kids there and we'll straighten your kids. Kind of idea. We're gonna make them not punk anymore. Shipping off kids to that and stuff. So, but it's interesting, like you said, kind of spreading the spores like throughout. So.
And then my follow-up to that is then, So the music of punk is, it's not necessarily left. I take your point in that it's just not right. It's just not far right. But there are definitely some forms of protest that have been utilized by liberal movements that have been appropriated by the right. And so to the point of the Christian music, Christian rock, Christian punk, things like that, to what extent do you think, and this is where you have to kind of speculate because I know you haven't necessarily researched it, to what extent do you think that that form of music is another version of right, as in far right or Christian right, appropriating left-leaning elements for their own purposes or as a way of undercutting them?
I think with certain things, I would say it kind of gets more to really the business culture idea, which kind of gets back to what I think Thomas Frank and Conquest of Cool, and his other article, Commodify Your Dissent, and just kind of this idea of no matter what you do to kind of rebel or dissent, it's going to be sold back because it sells, and people want to rebel and think of themselves as a rebellion. And so, like you said, I mean, that's, the independent letters writing and stuff like that, like, of course, was something that became, helped the conservative movement go through, push in the 70s, where originally that's something that came from more of the counterculture kind of. And so I kind of always see that as kind of a rolling cycle with everything going through. So.
I have a question about 2001's The Royal Tenenbaums. I was wondering if you thought that the Ramones sold out to do the soundtrack to that film.
Sorry, what film was it?
The Royal Tenenbaums, 2001.
I don't know if I would say they sold out. It's something I've been kind of, originally looking at punk rock, I used to think of a lot of these bands as like, well, they sold out. But it gets to a point, though, too, where people kind of have to make a living somewhat of a way. And that's something that a lot of these earlier groups in the 80s are like, I loved it and everything, but I actually wanted a place to live and to sleep and to have an actual meal. The Ramones, though, they're an interesting group because Johnny Ramone is a very avid, open Republican. He said that actually when they were introduced into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But on the other hand, the rest of the group was very leftist kind of thing. And so the sellout thing, though, I see a lot of the times, my own, I guess, personal view of why people go like Husker Du is to try to reach a larger audience. And so, I mean, if you're independent, I mean, if you limit your ability to communicate, then you're not going to reach as big of an audience. So. Mm-hmm.
How to put this? Seeing this research makes me feel old. This is my generation, right? And the generation of many of the professors in this room. It's a different generation.
Saw you on a cover, Wally.
But someone who comes from a different generation, do you think about people of my age differently now after doing this research?
Do I think of them differently?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
the past is another country.
With some of this, no, definitely. I mean, I see kind of this, some of this definitely influence and stuff, but just kind of, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different examples, but something, no, I definitely, studying this, I feel like I got to know some of my professors a little bit better, just from kind of learning what it was like them growing up and stuff, so.
Couldn't I make the argument that these professors are complacent and middle class and have kind of sold out?
Yep, you definitely could. I mean, I'm up here talking about punk rock, and I mean, it's one of those things, so, yeah.
I got a question for you. Go with the summation that punk rock, that throughout the decades, there's been different types of music. It started for me in the 50s with, anyway, with rock and roll, and then through all the other, music and stuff like that. Saying that punk rock was going to happen, do you think it was more a rebellion against Reagan, the conservative party, or politics in general?
Well, when it originally started, I would say it's one of those things where it was a little bit of both because, kind of the mid-1970s is this kind of shifting point worldwide, and I think that's what also made it so big in Britain. That's why it became popular there. But I think Reagan definitely for the United States in the 1980s, kind of was one of the things that fueled it to have such a target for them. But earlier though, with it, I think some of it more was, it was more of a rebellion against music itself at that time, which you could say was kind of getting conservative itself, with things like disco and kind of these, these rock stars from the, but a lot of bands, they didn't like the Rolling Stones or the Beatles. They're like, or they, thought they were great, but it's also like, well, I want my own music or something for my own generation, I think so.
So what's going on with rock nowadays? Because with the end of Nirvana and Rage Against the Machine, I feel like there's not much of a political drive behind rock, because they had Green Day for a little bit. But rock nowadays, I listen to all the time, it's just not caring about politics. Is that just like a general trend of getting away from politics, or is that just more like, hey, we like breaking shit and making shit like really loud and aggressive, and we're done with the politics? Because it seems like you listen to older 90s and 80s rock and everyone's just crying into the phone, but you listen to like rock or like from like new metal and stuff, they're just more into like the vibes of the music. Do you see like a correlation with that, or is it just kind of like since Reagan's gone, no one's upset anymore, sort of?
Well, I think it's still there. That's where especially like, punk rock's continued, but now with like things like the internet, it's much different to reach an audience where you don't need to worry about the radio stations or something. And radio stations themselves are kind of, it's a very kind of monopolized type of market, and so a lot of the radio stations across the country are owned by the same company, which makes it more difficult.
Would you consider the music nowadays punk rock at all, or they're just their own version of it?
Yeah, I definitely think it's still there, and some of that I guess would be by style, but also by, kind of people identifying with it. I think that there's kind of this identifying and association, which are kind of makes a band punk somewhat. If you say you're a punk band, it's kind of, you're a punk, but, well, what does that mean to you, kind of idea, so. But, that's, to get further into music, though, it's still there, and there's still a lot of, like, especially hip-hop, very political hip-hop that you don't necessarily hear on the radio or the main kind of stations. So it's it's out there, you just have to look for it a little bit more. Kind of like when it first started, of going through a record store and just looking for some label that you heard, so. Yeah.
I feel like this is along the same lines. Like with punk rock, you just expect kind of, dissent or just looking crazy and going against the grain. And nowadays, like I was just thinking about the Dixie Chicks speaking out against George Bush and how, I don't know if it's because it was unexpected from them because they're country, or if it's because they don't look punk, they don't look like they would be against what everyone else thinks at the time, but I don't know. I guess that's not a question.
Oh, I know, country used to be kind of badass, and there was even like something called cowpunk in the 80s. You had Blood in the Saddle with Tex and the Horseheads, and Hank Williams III, Hank Jr.'s son, Hank Sr.'s grandson, loves Black Flag, and he has a hardcore band called Ass Jack.
Yeah.
He even covered a Black Flag song on a benefit album Henry Rollins did for the what were the three kids who were accused in Arkansas. I believe the Arkansas, they were accused of satanic murder in Arkansas on very flimsy evidence. And a lot of bands covered Black Flag songs for this benefit record for them. And Hank Williams III is on it, as is Ryan Adams.
Yeah, Woody Guthrie, right?
Right. Yeah.
He was the a major mouthpiece for very political, working class kind of tunes, right?
Yeah, which some people,
And that came out of country music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think the question is, has country music lost its cause? Its political.
Yeah. Well, there's a punk band from the '80s who's still playing called the Dead Milkmen. In their song it's called "Commodify Your Dissent," and they say country music used to be about the country, but kind of saying now it's not, and it's all about money. Same with, they kind of criticize hip hop of just saying, and that gets the idea too, where, but I'm sure, it's still out there, but much more difficult because it's pushed. So.
Who's Hank Williams?
Hank Williams Sr., legendary country western guy.
He's at the movies, yeah.
Hank Williams Jr. did
No,
Are you ready for
no.
some football? TV commercials. Hank III is badass, and nobody knows about him unless you're really into the alt country scene. He's played in Cedar Rapids twice.
Hey, John, would a punk fan like you like to go up and see the Who with me May 1st?
I think I'll pass on the Who, but
Talking about my generation.
Well, it's about time we wrap it up. Again, I'd like to thank John, and I'm sure he can hang out for a little bit afterwards and continue the conversation. But thank you all for coming, and see you next semester when the new list of lectures come out. So thanks again.